So thank you for being here with us today, Dr. Anderson. So we'll just start talking about kind of your chapter in this book as a whole. So you talk about how there's not a definitive first college football game, but kind of a range of dates and teams that participated that historians argue constituted that first game. So what impact do you think that has on the myths and stories that have arose surrounding college football?
I don't think that there's a whole lot of debate about whether or not the game in 1869 was the first game. Harvard says no, it didn't really start till 1874. Some say, well, it likely began in 1869. We don't have any evidence that there was a game before that. So there's not. I don't know that Harvard's claim of it starting in 1874 really has a lot of traction, other than maybe on the Harvard campus, and they certainly had fun with it in 1974 when they did a true 100th anniversary of college football. But that 1869 is sort of the accepted game, and as I discuss in the chapter, they really clamped onto that in 1969 as calling it the 100th anniversary, and Chevrolet used it as part of an advertising campaign, creating this record. Here, let me just play just a segment of that record, and we'll talk about it.
Turn back the clock to November 2nd, 1869. We're at the rugby field at Rutgers University to witness history's first intercollegiate football game. The object? Score more goals than your opponents. The rules, just one. Survive.
So that's Chris Schenkel, who is a broadcaster for ABC Sports, and he's creating a presumed or play-by-play for that first game, because of course there was no play-by-play, there was no radio, there was only about 100 people at that first game, if that. The only report on it was from the Rutgers student newspaper, but here they are 100 years later trying to really reify this as this foundational moment, and they Chevrolet commissioned Arnold Freiberg to paint a depiction of that first game, and as when you look at it, you can see that he's got these rugged, strong men, when in reality we know that in 1869 these students were probably teenagers, 17, 18, 19 years old. Certainly didn't look like NFL linebackers. So they're engaging in some myth making here, like it was this big rugged start to this game, when in fact it was two games, one game at Rutgers and then a week later a game at the College of New Jersey, now known as Princeton. And there was supposed to be a third game, which would have been the tiebreaker, but it got canceled, and we're not entirely sure why. It may be that the presidents or the faculty at one or both institutions canceled it, or they just didn't play it. But that was the first big season.
Thinking about that Chevrolet advertising campaign and the Freiberg murals, how important was that campaign to kind of the lore and the history of what is remembered about college football from that time period today?
In 2019, we had the 150th anniversary of college football. But it's certainly part of a bigger process of, glorifying football and making it into this big thing. The game of the century was played, they called it the game of the century, was played in 1969 between Arkansas and Texas, because they were the two top teams of the year. And again, it was ABC Sports and Chris Schenkel broadcasting that game, but they convinced them to put it at the end of the season instead of in October, because they knew that this would be the big game at the end of the season, and it would probably determine the national championship. And both teams went in undefeated. Texas won in a close game. Of course, Penn State fans were upset that President Nixon, who was at the game, declared Texas as champions, because Penn State also went undefeated that season. So, that's why there's a lot of fun with whether or not there's even such a thing as a national championship until there was truly a national championship game.
So switching up a little bit, in this chapter, you talk a little bit about some of the instances of protests for social issues that college football teams have been involved in. Could you talk a little bit about the impact that had on college football in general and maybe the country as a whole?
I think football. I mentioned the great shootout, or the big shootout, the game of the century between Arkansas and Texas. The Arkansas students were very clever to do a protest against racism and the Vietnam War at that game, because they've got none other than the President of the United States in the stands. And Richard Nixon wasn't sitting up in some luxury box. He was in the stands amidst the fans, and they set up their peace symbol so that it would be right where he would be able to see it on this little hill outside of the stadium. And then you've got the other example that I gave of the Wyoming 14, the black players at the University of Wyoming, also in 1914, protesting against racism. They wanted to wear black armbands, and the Coach Eaton, fired them. I think it's interesting that he even used that term, fired, or because we talk about, oh, these are student athletes, they're not employees, but let's fire them. So, football was a great way to focus, and sports generally was a great way to focus attention on these kinds of issues.
And how do you think that the mass media has impacted which stories of college football and kind of these histories and myths have been remembered today?
Well, another chapter in the book by Robert Kerr at the University of Oklahoma, he writes about a Supreme Court case in 1984 that basically opened television broadcasting wide open, to where we've got just basically unlimited capacity to show TV games. In 1968, part of this advertising campaign was on the back of a brochure that that Chevrolet had, was the entire televised football schedule for 1968. The entire schedule on one sheet of paper. It's like 30 games, 32 games, something like that. Well, assuming you had enough hours in the day or enough TVs in your room to set them up, you could watch that many games in one Saturday. Realistically, I'm probably not far off that you can watch dozens of games on any given Saturday. So the media, I talked about the oversized role of football, but it's really the oversized role of football and the media together that, in terms of controlling or affecting higher education, because what do we schedule our Saturdays around? The football schedule. What impacts local economies? College football in a college town. A football weekend is an economic make or break, depending on how the football team is doing or how well received it is, and so that's why places like Athens, Georgia, and Happy Valley, State College, Pennsylvania, and college places that really center around the college. And even here in Columbia, South Carolina, think about the impact of having 80 or 100,000 people going to a game on a given Saturday, and then this last year with COVID eliminating or limiting fans. The economic impact was enormous, but the TV cameras were still there.
All right, the last question we wanted to ask you today, Dr. Anderson. So in the past, we know the Ivy Leagues kind of dominated football. So thinking about Princeton at the beginning, all those years ago, but today the Ivy Leagues are not at the top of the college football rankings. So do you think it's possible that we'll see another switch from the dominant institutional type right now of these large public research universities to a different institutional type, kind of being the dominant powers in college football?
No, I think in college football is too expensive. So to dominate in college football, you need to be a big institution with lots of resources. You can be a small institution and dominate in basketball. Look at Gonzaga. It's a small school, and it went undefeated until the very last game of the current, basketball season. And it's not a big school. I mean, it's well-funded school, but there's no way a Gonzaga could compete with the Ohio States and Alabamas of the world in football. It's just too expensive. And and so the smaller schools will continue to have football. They'll continue to have their traditions. One of the chapters in the book is about Division III football and the traditions in that. So that will continue to exist. The Ivy League will continue to play football. And, to tie it back to protests, last year in the fall of 2019, the students at Yale did something very clever. They knew that the only football game of the season to be televised would be the Harvard-Yale game, because it's one of the most famous rivalries. They don't play postseason. Even if they go undefeated, they're not going to a bowl game, and they're not going to be ranked or anything like that. But they knew that it was going to be televised. And so they staged a protest at that game. At halftime, they occupied the field. Well, this is significant for another reason. Yale still doesn't have lights on its field. So if they can't get the protesters off the field in enough time, they can't finish the game because they have no lights. And, it's getting dark in the end of November in New England. And so, it'll still have its place to play, but the days of smaller schools being able to compete in football are long past. And some even question the ethics of big time schools playing these smaller schools, for the so-called cupcake games, where they basically are playing for a paycheck and a chance to get demolished. How ethical is this really to be doing this? Because sometimes it even results in serious injury because the caliber of players is so different.
All right, well, thank you very much, Dr. Anderson. We really appreciate getting to talk to you about your chapter and things like that. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Thank you.